So we have our next speaker is Professor Krishan Kumar, who we all know. I mean, he doesn't need no introduction. Very renowned educationist. So he would talk about. I had a chat with him before we came here. So he wants to talk about something very interesting, something which has to do with the way we see things, the way we produce knowledge, the way we educate, since he's an educationist. Because all the problems that we've discussed in the last 2 days, to find alternatives, one of the basic conditions one of the basic requirements or conditions which is necessary to sort of to look at the world in a different way is how you deal with knowledge differently, how you if I may be permitted to say so, how you decolonize your mind, because we are so used to thinking in a certain way, which Devinder also keeps talking about in all his discussions at various fora. One of the problems that we face today when we talk about the broken system and how we can recover our traditional knowledge. Now, this recovering our traditional knowledge is also it's a big crisis, it's a philosophical crisis. So people have said, even Nehru once said that in his book. He wrote that even great civilization they go several steps backwards because they lose their knowledge, and nobody is able to figure out how people lose. Societies lose knowledge, which actually in the first place made them, achieve a certain substantial progress. So since he's an educationist, he will talk about how we view rural life, how we view rural versus urban, what are the mindsets that we have created in terms of education. I think what he told me was very interesting when we were discussing before we came here. It really ties into the whole problem of whether we can produce, whether we can as a society, as a collective, alternative knowledge system. Dr.
Thank you, Mr. Venu. About 70 years ago, we were persuading farmers to start using chemical fertilizers and pesticides. In many parts of the country, where the community development program of the 1950s had been running for almost 15-20 years, it was deployed for teaching, persuading, propagating modern agriculture. And at that time, if you read the reports of the 1960s, you will notice that in many parts of the country it seems that farmers were resisting this new knowledge. And the agricultural universities and school textbooks and various other resources were deployed to make sure that this propagation succeeded. And we know it did. Then from around the 1990s, you begin to notice that people want to now persuade more and more farmers to gradually abandon chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And today, of course, we are all very keen on doing that. Sometime in the middle of this period, we are talking of 70 years, you will notice that in 1970s, 80s, school textbooks were still giving this figure that India has among the world's lowest per hectare consumption of chemical fertilizers. And that shows that we have a long way to go in modernizing our agriculture. Now, if you look at these attempts to persuade the farmer, in one way at one point and in another way at this point, then of course you can say that that was the need at that time and this is the need now. And that way we can get rid of the problem. But as Mr. S.P. Singh has pointed out, that we are looking at how knowledge is transmitted, who transmits, and who receives it. If you listen to Akashwani's programs for farmers every evening, in different languages, they are broadcast all over the country. And I often tune in just to see how the farmer is being addressed. You often get telephone calls from farmers saying such and such pest has spoiled my crop, what can I do? And the expert at this end will say, take 10 grams of endosulfan and mix it with 20 grams of that and put it in 100 grams of water and then sprinkle it and so on and so forth. Now it's assumed that the person at the receiving end will not know what is endosulfan. That his chemistry, his knowledge will not be of the kind that the expert needs to elaborate on to say that these are these ingredients of what you are doing. He's simply a receiver. And the receiver does the needful. Now this relationship is where I think history draws our attention. The relationship between who teaches and who is taught. And if you break down this grammar into demography, then you realize that the teacher is the knowledgeable urban world, and the taught is the supposedly backward, ignorant, superstitious, poor farming world of the Indian village. And from this perspective, if you look at the role of schooling, then schools are essentially human export centers, where the smartest children are gradually groomed, selected, they pass exams, and it's ensured that they will find their way in the world by leaving the village. And this is exactly how the aim of education is articulated in our times, that if you are a smart boy or girl, you think ahead of others, then what are you doing in this village? Your fate has to be somewhere else. So the village is essentially an exporter of its best human talent and resource. Those who are left behind in the village are supposedly people who have nowhere to go. And if you are making sense of this food chain idea, which is the key idea of this conference, from the point of view of education, then it's obvious that the food chain and its problems are part of the chain of knowledge in which we find ourselves historically placed at the receiving end. Our best historians often tell you that the fate of the peasantry is kind of sealed, because all societies that go through the process of modernization follow or will follow the trajectory of the European world, where gradually the proportion of the peasantry came down and the proportion of those who live on other means of livelihood goes up, cities grow, villages decline, and this is going to happen. And therefore, if it's happening in our times, we should be prepared for this kind of what looks to more sensitive people a tragic process. In fact, successive finance ministers have publicly said that India's demographic transition will stabilize when the rural population comes down to about 40% or still less, because the contribution that the village, through its primarily agricultural production system, makes to the GDP doesn't justify the kind of demographic space they occupy. It's much easier to serve them when they would have moved to cities. Former chairperson of the Planning Commission said it in so many words, that it's much easier to serve people where they are living in a concentrated space. There one can provide various kinds of services, but in a scattered space it's much tougher. Now this larger discourse of development, of policies for growth, etc., leaves very little room for a vision for what our villages can look like. Well, the understanding is that when a village develops, it begins to look like a town. The town represents where we are or where we shall be. Villages represent where we have been or yesterday's world. They remind us of how things were. The here of history is here in the city. There, it's the forgotten period of history, the old period. Now, this is a very deep asymmetry in our thinking system, and this asymmetry is responsible for so many concerns that we are raising today. In fact, yesterday when Dr. Devendra Sharma was talking about, was critiquing the concept of GDP, he reminded me of my old friend, the late Professor Narinder Singh, who was perhaps the first Indian to talk about the crisis of economics in the context of the ecological crisis. This was his PhD dissertation, a very famous study under Dr. Majumdar in the early JNU. It's called Economics and the Crisis of Ecology, which has now become a bit of a classic. And his later book, The Keynesian Fallout, also made a similar point that an economy or an economics that doesn't distinguish between goods and bads and regards both as contributors to growth has something deeply problematic about it. It's deeply unethical, but it's also deeply asymmetrical. And I think this is where our challenge begins, the intellectual challenge of engaging with the crisis that we are faced with. In our country, in the whole of South Asia, where the proportion of the rural population is pushing India into the century in which we already are, that kind of discourse basically is rooted in this deeper asymmetry, which we inherit from history. And I feel that when we are trying to do very, very useful intellectual exercises like what was presented yesterday by a number of presenters, namely ways of giving a monetary value to what the environment, the natural environment contributes to human health and welfare, then I think it's very important for us to also take history into account for making our costing process more accurate. If we are assessing the contribution that a tree makes, or the contribution that a river makes, or the water of a tank makes to human health, if we are doing that kind of costing, it will be something seriously problematic if we don't take into account where that river is today. Because that river, if it's already being used for certain purposes, which are deeply polluting it, if the soil has already ingested a lot of pesticide, then the cost of freeing that soil from that process, or freeing that river from its pollution, and the cost of liberating it from those, you might say, forces, elements, people who have invested in polluting that river, who have already got a lot of money invested in it. Freeing the river from that kind of investment will also require to be put into this costing process. Because our natural resources are no more natural in that sense. They are socially occupied. Each inch of land is socially occupied, whether it's forests, whether it's rivers, or anything else. And if we are talking about, therefore, a turning point, or looking for a turning point in history, then I think it's very important for us to talk about recovery costs. When an institution decays, and if you want to set it back on the path of growth, then you must take into account what it will mean to help that institution to recover to the point from which it can start growing. If we don't take that into account, then we are seriously misled by figures that we think can be used from the 0 point at which we are, because at this point we have become aware that now onwards we will not propagate more or increased use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. We have been doing that all the time, but now we won't. Well, this is not the zero point of history, because a great deal of social, financial, political investment has already been made in a certain vision, in a certain discourse of growth, of development of India as a country, of how it will catch up with the rest of the world, where its models are, where its vision is, and so on. And therefore, in terms of the balance of knowledge, if India is still looking at itself as a receiver of knowledge from places with which it has to catch up, then it's not an inventive India. It's just as colonized as it was 100 or 200 years ago. Its imagination is not an inventive imagination. The late Professor Yashpal, who led us into a new policy for a national curriculum, used to say precisely that. And he used to remember an occasion when the first space satellites were to be sent. He was heading ISRO at that time. A proposal was made that perhaps some of the scientists should be sent to America for learning about how that exercise was done there. And money was available for it. But Yashpal's question at that time, to the government at that time, was where did the Americans send their scientists? Surely they invented something. And why do we then need to learn all the time? Now that voice of inventive nationalism is unfortunately very rare in our midst. We are looking for shorter ways to overcome a crisis that has taken a while in terms of our positive contribution to it, to get created. As responsible members of history, we have to take into account what we have done to the rural citizenry. Of course, the constitutional schools in the country are part of CBSE, out of the 1 million schools the country otherwise has. At the secondary level itself, we have something like 2 lakh schools, out of which only 18,000 are part of CBSE. So we are talking about the rest of the schools. And overwhelming majority of rural children go to those schools. The investment in those schools tells us that they are not just smaller citizens because they are children, they are also less important citizens. Otherwise, our investments won't differ so much in different kinds of schooling processes. Ratios like 1:2 or 1:3 is something we can understand, but ratios like 1:19, for example, for a Navodaya school run by the same state system as in terms of its relationship with the average rural schools, tells you something about the character or the vision of education we have. The Navodaya is like any other residential sort of public school. It's one in a district, and therefore it's the chief center for human resource expert. It first selects its children at grade 6, the best possible hard-working children get into that school, and then they go through the next 6 to 12 years, grade 12 education, and then they are available to the nation. They are harnessed from India's villages. This larger system of rural education in India is also as broken as the food system. And in fact, its contribution to this broken chain that we are all concerned about in this conference has to be taken into account, because ultimately all education is a process of persuasion. And we can't just persuade people for going north now and south next day, because persuasion becomes a culture. And the culture of knowledge that we are stuck in treats the rural person, the peasant's child, as somebody who actually can't think for himself, as somebody who has to be told what is best for him. We have broken his morale long ago. Today, of course, the crisis has become physical, as Mr. S.P. Singh has pointed out. That crisis of farmer suicide should have shocked India's higher education in the social sciences nearly 30 years ago. There is simply no book of sociology which will explain how the phenomena of suicide can occur on any scale in the countryside. anywhere in the world. Suicide, since its classic Durkheim road called suicide, has been known to be an urban phenomenon. That's where anomie is, that's where alienation is, that's where loss of community is. It should have woken up the entire social science faculty of our higher education system to see what's going on here. How did these things happen in our villages? But 30 years later, we are still simply adding figures and wondering about what's going on here, and there are debates about this matter, as Mr. S.V. Singh pointed out, and we all know that there is no agreement as to why farmers are committing suicide. All of these, friends, are simply symptoms of a deep asymmetry. And that asymmetry lies in our vision, in our understanding of what is the nation. Are we a nation? Because a nation means that we think together. Now, on this matter of what is happening in Indian villages, we certainly don't think with them, because we took away their thinking rights long ago. If we want to restore those rights or repatriate those rights to them, then a whole lot of things will have to change in how we conceptualize curriculum, what we think about teaching, the language of teaching, the language in which we suggest remedies, and the speed at which we keep changing our mind as to what we should tell the villager to do. All of that will have to change if we want the situation to start getting better, or at least stop getting worse, which it is on a daily basis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Krishan Kumar, for that very, very provocative presentation. Inventive nationalism, as you said. I think we have to, there's no other alternative to looking at different knowledge system which is not received from somewhere else. I just want to make one remark in the context of what he said. You know, we as journalists, Sujay will also talk about it in his own, in a different context, but you know, we spend our lifetime dealing with policymakers, the state, government, and we find that wherever you go in the government officials are all the time, you know, receiving knowledge from elsewhere, from the West, and there is a huge struggle within there may be a few minority, some bureaucrats or some who may sort of talk about indigenously designed policy, you know. But my experience is, I mean, SP would also, it's an uphill battle. The way technologies get forced onto the, you know, in the context of the food system. I mean, as a newspaper man, I can tell you, I'm an editor of a couple of newspapers. Monsanto used to regularly throw money at us, saying, you just do full page advertorials, you know, and we will pay you any amount. So we, in the Express, Devendra, I was financial secretary, said no, we're not taking any advertorial. So that's the way they operate.